Okay, that's good. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to our clients, media partners, and attendees wherever you may be in the world. Welcome to today's webinar on Taliban return former U.S. ambassador interview. Before we begin, let me quickly introduce myself and the speakers first. Starting with myself, my name is Lester Chan and I'll be your host today. Currently, I am the head of wealth management at Saxo. Previously, I was a portfolio manager and strategist at different investment management companies running global macro and asset allocation strategies. I worked in New York and Beijing before moving back to Hong Kong. Today, it's a real treat to have the former United States ambassador to Afghanistan under the Obama and Trump administrations, Ambassador Hugo Llorens, join us. When Ambassador Llorens was in Kabul, he led the largest U.S. embassy in the world with a staff of more than 8,500 U.S., Afghan, and third country nationals, representing 22 U.S. government agencies. Ambassador Llorens has been a diplomat for almost 40 years, having been posted to numerous countries spanning 6 continents. Aside from having previously served as the U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan, Ambassador Llorens was also the U.S. ambassador to Honduras under the Bush and Obama administrations, the U.S. Consul General in Sydney and Vancouver, and the U.S. Deputy Chief of Mission in Madrid and Buenos Aires. Ambassador Llorens also spends time in Washington, D.C. by serving on the White House staff as the Director of Indian Affairs. Ambassador Llorens, welcome again and good to see you after we last connected in Madrid and Vancouver. Great to have you join us today. And
good to see you, Lester.
Good to see you, yes. And also joining us today is Mr. Steen Jakobsen, Saxo's Chief Economist and CIO. Mr. Jakobsen has been with Saxo for over 20 years. Prior to joining Saxo, he worked with Swiss Bank Corp, Citibank, Chase Manhattan, UBS, and served as Global Head of Trading, FX, and Options at Christiana, which is now Nordea. Welcome, Steen. So the way we're going to structure the webinar today is that we'll first discuss what's been going on in Afghanistan for those who may not be following the situation there so closely now that the US is officially withdrawn. Then we will move on to the possible short and long-term outcomes from a geopolitical, economics, and markets perspective in context of scenario analysis. After that, we will touch on what the Afghanistan situation could mean for geopolitical tensions in a global perspective. And finally, we'll open it up to Q&A from the audience. So first question, directed to Ambassador Llorens. There seems to be a few questions why the country fell apart in just weeks to the Taliban. There was the paper tiger army, there was the backdoor deals, and most importantly, do you think it's accurate to say that morale was just very low, where there was no real clear Afghan state to fight for, with President Ghani and his advisors having limited influence outside Kabul? And so that's why the Afghan military gave up so quickly instead of putting up a long fight like the US would have hoped.
Lester, before I answer that question, if I could just take literally a couple of minutes just to digress a little bit. I think it's important to have a bit of context. I mean, again, let's just go back why we went into Afghanistan. We all know September 11. What has been the strategic goal of the US and the West, the allies, in the last 20 years? I mean, really, it's important to start there. And the strategic objective has not changed in the last 20 years. And it is to ensure that Afghanistan is never again used as a platform by terrorists to attack the United States and its allies. So that's been the unwavering strategic goal. Now, the U.S. Made innumerable errors in Afghanistan. I mean, we very quickly, President Bush, some people criticize him for taking his eye off the ball and sort of going into Iraq. President Obama has been criticized. I'm not leveling these criticisms, okay? But that he surged very early, massive troop increase, and then he quickly withdrew. So it's kind of an erratic approach. And then President Trump, who I worked for, I was his first chief of mission in Afghanistan. He was a skeptic. He wanted out all the way, very similar to President Biden. But one very quick point that I would make is that despite all these huge mistakes and the massive expenditure of treasure and blood by ourselves and our allies, we actually learned some lessons, okay? It wasn't like we were bereft of any lessons. By the time I got there, I think we really were able to craft what I would be a military diplomatic intelligence and development matrix that I worked on with General Nicholson, my military counterpart, and with President Trump's new national security team that was premised on this. It was very small U.S. and allied presence. The military side would be, a small number of special forces, small number of advisors, a small air contingent. Maybe we had 120 aircraft in the country spread in a network of bases around the country. We had a very good intelligence partners, our allies and the Afghans. And that was it. And just so that you understand, I think, and that was all rolled out in a South Asia strategy that President Trump announced in a speech given August 2017. I was very comfortable with that. I felt we were there. And the idea was a conditions-based approach. We're not going anywhere, but we can create conditions with minimal expenditure of blood and treasure that the Taliban could never achieve a strategic military victory. And I think we were there. We were there. So my main criticism, and I will answer your question, was that I think there were two double mistakes made by our two commanders in chief. First, President Trump got away from the strategy that we developed as he removed his orthodox advisors. Think Secretary Mattis, Secretary Tillerson, and National Security Advisor McMaster. And he really began to politicize the issue. I think the original sin of all of this was his signing of a very flawed agreement between the US and the Taliban, which completely excluded our allies in the Afghan government. They were cut out from the negotiations. By the way, it was a democratically elected government with all its flaws, number one. And then number two, President Biden, that agreement called for the withdrawal of American forces by May 1, 2021. The second mistake that I would say was President Biden's decision to ratify that agreement and withdraw the forces. He took a few more months. And again, the bottom line, it was, to answer your question then, we were spending about 2% of US defense spending on Afghanistan. So you guys as investors, just figure that out. We're spending $20 billion in the whole package of a $750 billion defense budget, okay? Most killed in action that we had since 2015 was 22, okay? So there, again, we had the sustainable model. And the purpose was to support the negotiations of a political settlement between the Afghans themselves, between the Kabul government and the Taliban, which would have resulted in some type of power sharing, okay? But US and allied equities would have been protected. The precipitous withdrawal of US forces was calamitous. I think it was a psychological blow. Think France, 1940. How did the largest, most powerful army in the world in 1940 lose in 5 weeks? No one expected that one. I don't think no one that I know of expected such a quick collapse. But it was really about the psychological collapse, the morale of the government in Kabul, the political class in Kabul, and then by extension, the security forces were completely demoralized. It was a long process, in my view, which began with the signing of this agreement where they were cut out. And they knew America was, many have described it, and I kind of agree, now that I'm no longer in government, that it was a capitulation agreement. The US capitulated, I hate to say it, to the Taliban in that agreement of February 2020. So it was a psychological effect. And the Afghan forces had fought well as long as they had US air. We created them and taught them to fight with air. Air for ground support, air for intelligence, and air for logistics. In a matter of literally weeks, 6 weeks, it was all gone. So a model that they fought and fought well. By the way, the Afghans lost 65,000 men in the fight. Okay, so they were doing 95% of the fighting, 99% of the dying. So this, by bottom line, as a person who's been in foreign policy almost 40 years, this did not have to happen. There were strategic blunders of the highest order made by Presidents Trump and Biden. But here we are. This is why you're having this conversation, because the US position in Afghanistan has collapsed and the Allied position. And then now you have kind of a pre-September 11th situation where the Taliban is back in power. But I would say the main reason was psychological, but then of course the physics of the battlefield, of the strategic impact of a very small air contingent on the battlefield situation, okay?
Right. I see. So really, it just began with the how the agreement was flawed in the first place, kind of like how you described it. Indeed. Okay, so thanks for that elaborate answer, Ambassador. Second question. It's interesting that if you go back in time, it's actually not the first time that a foreign power has been unsuccessful in suppressing Afghanistan. In fact, Afghanistan has been nicknamed the graveyard of empires for its success in resisting foreign occupation, including the British and the Soviets. So a question to both speakers. Do you see the current situation as kind of like a continuation of history?
Well, I'll be very quick and then kind of turn it over to Steen. Look, yes, I mean, the whole, I wouldn't call it the graveyard of empires, although
Yeah.
you can make that argument. I would call it more the grinding of empires. And you can go back to ancient history, the Persians were the first on the scene. Then Alexander the Great came in, the Macedonians. Then you had the period of the Silk Road period, which is fascinating, where trade between the great Chinese Empire and the great Roman Empire, great period in Afghan history, period of great prosperity. And then, of course, then you had the nightmare of Genghis Khan. Then you had, the Mughals came in, and then finally, exactly the great game where the Russians coming in from the north, the British coming in from India and the south, and the great game was about Afghanistan. And no one has ever truly been able to control Afghanistan. We know that. And so there is that connection that, this idea that, well, the Soviets came, the Americans came, and Afghanistan is still around, okay?
Steen, would you have anything to add?
Absolutely. I think it's pretty clear that, and we'll talk about that later in the questioning, but this is the end of what started as the Nixon doctrine, which set in motion the exit from Vietnam. And that was really defined in the fact that the US doesn't want to be a policeman to the rest of the world. And I think being the market guy here, I think there are two consequences. I think, first of all, we should not ignore the fact that the US can no longer afford financially to be involved as much as they used to be in terms of the money spent. The ambassador briefly touched on the fact, but I think we're talking about $300 million a day just to be in Afghanistan. I mean, there's been spent more than $1 trillion under the 20 years that we've been there, and that is only the directly related cost. But you don't even have to listen to me. You can talk to the head of the UK Foreign Affairs Committee, Tom Turgenhat, who said, the analogy between what's going on in Afghanistan with the US is similar to what we saw in the 1956 Suez crisis. We knew at the time that the British Empire was over, but that was the catalyst that dictated that now we for sure had the evidence that things has changed going forward. And I think to some extent Afghanistan is that. As the ambassador rightly put, the blame for this in terms of the operational part of it goes all the way back to when they actually got in with President Bush, from Obama's new policy pivot, and lately, of course, Biden, who is basically just executing on the wishes of the American people in terms of getting American soldiers back. The way it was done, demoralizing the setup with the allies is something that needs to be paid, but it will have very, very clear impact on the situation. Also because, seen from the US, it's a pretty simple story. We want US out of Afghanistan. We want to save our soldiers for future repivoting of our resources. But what is left behind is three major things: refugees, terrorism, and drug trades, which is becoming the issue of the regional players and very much by the European players. And what we've seen in the political space over the course of the last week is that, one, Japan has just upped the ante in terms of defense spending by 50 billion. We have seen that the European Commission, the EU as a system, is now operating and trying to give additional support to countries surrounding Afghanistan in order to reduce the refugees. And don't forget that during the first or the second invasion of Afghanistan by the Russian, we had alone in Iran 1.5 million refugees coming on. So this, in terms of looking for the outcome of what it will mean for local and domestic and global, the global tectonic plates, this has only just started, Lester.
Yeah, we'll touch more on that later with the refugee crisis. We'll have a question on that. Thanks for alluding to that. Now that Steen, let's keep. We want to talk about the markets a little bit. Now that So let's kind of look at the market so far, given what has transgressed. There really hasn't been a lot of action globally. We have seen the dollar Afghani at historical highs, but then nothing else has moved much. Across the region, MSCI Turkey, UAE are still up over the month. So Steen, do you think it's fair to say that global markets haven't really moved because investors are saying like, what's happening in Afghanistan is tragic, but it doesn't really have much of an impact on their portfolios, given this could take years to play out?
All of the above, of course, but the impact, of course, is a slow process, changing exactly the analogy of the tectonic plates. But I'll say that right now, of course, monetary policy inflation is far more important to the investors than what happens at the margin in Afghanistan. And for the record, it wasn't a surprise that the US was going out. As the ambassador said, there was a deal struck last year in February. It was clearly communicated. The execution was different, and ignoring the advice of the allies was something to play with. But overall, I think we are just here that markets are only reacting to stuff that are surprising. So the way we look forward in the financial market is that we are discounting the future. And if there is a deviation from the future, it's impacting policy. I don't think the market right now has been both able or willing to actually compound the impact on what we talk about: refugees, defense spending, and issues like Taiwan, Iraq, and of course Iran, that becomes very, very relevant in the next phase here.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that. In the near term, now that you kind of touched on growth and inflation outlook being important, in the near term, but with Biden's approval ratings collapsing from the Afghanistan decision, do you think there is a possibility that the Republicans would seize on Biden's weakness to push back more forcefully against the upcoming debt ceiling? Because if the debt ceiling doesn't get lifted, a US government shutdown could then actually be disruptive to the US economy and global markets, and possibly also delay tapering. So could that be a pathway, or is that really a possibility, you think?
The debt ceiling, no. The debt ceiling is a technical factor that needs to be resolved, because otherwise the US is bankrupt. So the debt ceiling will, of course, be a political pawn, but I don't think so. Right now, the narrative, and I think the ambassador can confirm this, the narrative in the US right now is that the Biden administration is telling us that evacuating 125,000 people out of Afghanistan is a massive success, probably one of the biggest achievements ever in logistics. On the other hand, the Republicans are pushing back, saying this was violating the trust that we built up with foreign allies. This is against all of what we wanted to achieve. And even Mr. Trump is chiming in, despite the fact that, as the ambassador said, he actually activated that exit himself. So, no, it will be very difficult to play, because you have to remember, I think in the last poll I saw out of the US, 70% of the Americans wanted the American troops out of Afghanistan.
Okay, thanks for that. Now let's go back to the Afghanistan situation. And another question to both speakers. So Afghanistan, as we know, is a rich cradle of resources. According to some reports, the combined value of minerals is estimated to be between 1 to 3 trillion US dollars. And by comparison, opium poppy production was just at $350 million. So however, there have been issues in the past with extracting these minerals. In particular, Afghanistan does have the world's biggest reserve of lithium, which is important to batteries and EVs. Do you think much of this will change under the Taliban?
But by the way, I'll go back just a little bit to Steen's point on the political impact of this before we go on to just chime in. Look, this is not comparable to Vietnam. When Richard Nixon made the decision to withdraw from Vietnam, and he signed this agreement, which was another bad agreement, it was another defeat. The United States was defeated by North Vietnam. We had 550,000 troops in Vietnam. We were spending, something like 35% of our defense budget on the war. The people were out in the streets. They were burning the draft cards. I mean, there was violence in America. I lived there. I was a college student. So it was a different situation. Steen is absolutely right. All the polling suggested about 65% of American people wanted the end of the forever war. But no one was protesting or clamoring. We have a professional army. Our presence was minimal. We had a residual force. I think this is important to understand. We're not talking about 2010, when we had 100,000 US troops, 150,000 NATO troops, we're spending $140 billion on the war. This is my world. I am telling you that what we're spending on Afghanistan was $20 billion. Military, diplomatic, my embassy, economic development, okay? The biggest in the world, and our intelligence component, our CIA and other component was 20 billion, 2.5% of US defense spending. So I just want to, so that it is not a comparable situation to Vietnam. Granted, people wanted out, people were tired, and presidents both, and Steen is absolutely right. President Trump and President Biden reflected that. But look, with very quickly with regards to the resource issue, yes, I mean, Afghanistan is a remarkably rich country in resources. I was there when the U.S. Geological Survey did the famous report. I think it was 2012, a very comprehensive report where Afghanistan was sitting on $1 trillion of easily recoverable reserves. I mean, what we knew was kind of there. I mean, there's been very little exploration in Afghanistan, and we all know. I mean, you have, the copper, iron ore, oil, gas, rare earths. It's got precious stones of every kind. Afghanistan has lead. Just remarkable. It's a place like if you were in parts of the Western U.S. in the late 19th century, still kind of untouched. The problem you have in Afghanistan, of course, is infrastructure. So you have, for example, China has a great concession, the INAC copper mine, one of the great copper veins ever discovered in history, maybe the largest. And they brought in their engineers. I've, talked a lot to my Chinese counterpart. The Taliban attacked them and they stole it, but ultimately it would require massive infrastructure investments by the Chinese to be able to get that copper out of the country. So there is you have kind of a logistical infrastructure issue, and to even consider that, you're going to need a period of stability. I don't think, and again, I'll really turn, Steen is the expert on this, but again, I did talk to a lot of American companies over the years that, just occasionally would touch base with us in the embassy, had a long-term view. And I don't, I think it would take many years. I think people will want to see how it all plays out with the political equation. But yet someday the stars will align. And I think, the resources is, the spice road for Afghanistan, for the future prosperity.
Right. Steen, will you have anything to add to that as well?
Only that the ambassador's vision is right. I mean, we live in a world where we need 10x the output of copper relatively to what we have today. So the marginal utility and value of this mining that you can do in Afghanistan will be attractive for commodity players that historically has been enablers of both building the infrastructure and doing it. So I think ultimately down the line, but I think what has changed since the Cuba crisis and all the other crises where also you saw commodity houses go in and be a proactive player. This time politically is very, very difficult. So there needs to be an alignment is that this is in the interest of both the Afghan population, but also the international community. And into that game, I think it's very difficult. As the ambassador rightly say, if anything, the international coordination on foreign policy is the worst we've probably seen since the Fulton speech by Churchill in just after World War II. So that's what will be lacking, not the economic incentive. The economic incentive ultimately, in my opinion, should drive it, but it's probably a 10-year story rather than a 1 to 2 year story.
So it's going to take time for everything to be aligned, indeed. Okay, let's move on to now how things might progress from here in terms of discussing two possible scenarios. So the first scenario, in 2020, foreign aid accounted for over 40% of Afghan's economy. Now that the aid has stopped, sanctions are back, and the Taliban has been unable to get their hands on the 10 billion central bank reserves sitting in New York. With only the money from the opium trade, the Taliban will be unable to cover Afghanistan's annual budgets. And this basically means the country could be on the brink of economic collapse and hyperinflation even. The Taliban will then have to deal with using just 80,000 fighters to suppress the discontents of 38 million people, inflicting the possibility of a civil war. Ambassador Llorens, two questions. What are the chances of a scenario where the Taliban forms an inclusive government with their political enemies so that they might be recognized by their international community and continue to get foreign aid? And do you think the Taliban has changed much over the past 20 years, or they're now led by a different sort of leadership that contains more moderates than extremists?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. Again, we're looking at kind of crystal balling this. Look, I would say, first of all, the economic impact, as you say, is going to be dramatic. Yes, economic development assistance accounted for around, you're probably right, 40% of Afghanistan's GDP. But what I see, where I see the immediate impact is that the US and its allies, and all of us were major contributors, our European allies, Australia, Japan. There was money that was transferred every month into the Afghan treasury that allowed for the operational payment of a very significant percentage of operational costs of the government, so that salaries taken. I think we were paying about 70% of the total budget pie, the donor community. So that what you're having in Afghanistan right now is the money has stopped flowing. And as you say, that is going to create, it's already creating a dramatic crisis on the ground, particularly on the economic side. So there is pressure on the Taliban. I mean, the Taliban is they're very nasty people. They really are, trust me, very brutal. They are killers. But they also live in the real world, and they're sitting there in Kabul. They understand they've seized power. They have a government to run, and they've taken an approach that, at least at the very beginning, offers some possibility. And one of them is they've engaged some of their opposition, namely former President Karzai, former Foreign Minister, Chief Executive Abdullah, people I know extremely well, and they're sitting in Kabul. They never left. And they are talking to the Taliban, and the idea is to try to create some formula for an interim government. I expect that in the end of the day, we'll see. I mean, I think but there's going to be no democracy in Afghanistan. I mean, the model that the best model that you can see is think Iran under the mullahs, right? But if the Taliban is smart, and they want to leverage resources from the international community, they will try to create some kind of interim government. They will try to moderate some of their interpretations of Sharia law. That's hard to do, because although some of the senior political leadership who I've met they are more sophisticated than was the case 20 years ago, when they were just a bunch of crazy students. The rank and file, the base, the political base of the Taliban is pretty back there still. They're still back 20 years ago. So there's an interesting dynamic that will play out. If I could predict it, I don't have that crystal ball. But I think to close it out, what we need to do is the United States, its allies, the UN system, China, Russia, we all have a stake in a stable Afghanistan. And I think what we need to do is we need to ensure that the humanitarian assistance continues to flow through the UN, not the US, indirectly, and the NGO system. Food help for the displaced, assistance to refugees, health. I mean, there are hundreds, thousands of wounded. I mean, the situation is very dire. First, humanitarian assistance, and then engage in a very dialogue where you establish a certain series of conditions on the Taliban so that we can consider resuming the potential diplomatic recognition, which I think will take some time, but that will ultimately result in a renewal of economic assistance. And it is an inclusive government, the Taliban respecting the rights of its citizens, particularly the rights of women, who have made so much progress in the last 20 years, and also that they don't harbor terrorists, that they collaborate with us on terrorism. Steen mentioned the whole issue of opium and heroin. They need to cooperate with the international community on that. That's a global issue. So it's going to take some time, but I would start with, and in this, the U.S. should not do it alone. We are not the lone player anymore. We've been defeated. That's the reality. We need to work very closely with our allies and other key stakeholders, by the way, which include Iran. Okay.
Right. So there is a chance for them to, if they're smart, to be forming that inclusive government. Yeah, indeed. But then, as you said, they're not going to go into democracy. There's no way, right? Okay. And Steve, two questions on the markets. If the Afghan economy collapses and the country does go back into a civil war, what are the economic and market-related implications to the region, particularly with regards to Pakistan and Iran, which we touched on, and globally as well? And then on the other hand, if the Taliban does form a coalition with their political enemies, are there any trades that might surprise to the upside?
You know, strategically, I think if the US was still in the mold of doing hard power, they would leave Afghanistan alone, because what we also have to realize is there are 14 different ethnicities inside Afghanistan. You have 70% of the population under the age of 25. It is the youngest population, in my awareness, anywhere in the world. So the constraints of an optimistic view on the economy and the ability for the Taliban to survive is actually that I don't think they have a massive support. I know they don't have a massive support, but the constraint is that a lot of these young people under the age of 25 never really was, experiencing what the ambassador saw when he was on the ground and everything else. They don't have that experience. They're brought up with Western music. They're brought up with a total different set of sort of values today. So if we still had a hard power in the US, that would probably be the strategy that would be pursued by both the US and allies. But I think this is different because there is this component of refugees first and foremost, and secondly, because of the potential terrorism slash drug trade. But in terms of the impact on the region, it's pretty clear that, and now I'm talking out of term, and I should leave this to the ambassador. But for me, Pakistan is very much becoming a proxy of China in the region. It seems like there is a very close relationship between Pakistan and China on every single level, including investments. I will see that siphon into the Afghan economy as well. We already see on the copper mining, of course, those right officially, as it sits right now, sits with the Chinese. It will have a destabilizing impact on refugees. As I said, during the occupation from the Russians, there was 1.5 million refugees going to Iran. And for the record, the talks on extending the talk with Iran has broken down in Geneva. So we're not getting the amount of oil that we expect to come to the market, at least in the open market from the Iranian right now. So for me, I think the Middle East at all times is a very, very, very risky cocktail geopolitically. I think the propensity for this to ignite again is much, much bigger, because I don't, as an economist, see any shape or form in which the Taliban can execute a policy of openness and friendliness and deliver on that, and at the same time have that amount of elasticity to play to, have that amount of interest in terms of young people that they need to keep in check. Of course, they are, as the ambassador already said, a very, very cruel bunch of people that operate and use all kinds of strategy to implement that. I think history will show that this is more of an end game for Taliban than it's an end game for the future of Afghanistan.
Interesting thought there. Okay, that actually brings me to the second scenario that I wanted to ask. So the second scenario is kind of a little bit more depressing. It's where the Taliban runs out of money and options, and they just go back to squashing dissent using violence. And Ambassador Llorens has said that the Taliban are very cruel. So that is possible. And basically, they just go back to the worst days of Taliban rule in the 1990s, pre-September 11, where their only allies are the terrorist organizations again. But of course, even with terrorists, there are allies and enemies. For instance, Al-Qaeda is an ally of the Taliban, ISIS-K is an enemy, and hence that's why we saw the bombing at the Kabul airport. So Ambassador Llorens, two questions. What do you think the chances are of this scenario where the Taliban harbors terrorists again, despite agreeing with the US last year that it wouldn't do so? And I know you said it was a bad agreement. And if we do gravitate towards this scenario, is there a remote chance that the US will go back into Afghanistan?
That's a great question. Again, I don't have the crystal ball, but I would say that the answer is between the first and the second scenario. I see a hybrid scenario on that. Again, you're not going to have democracy. You're going to have arbitrary rule. There are going to be people who are going to be killed. Really, there's a kind of a blanket over the rest of Afghanistan. There's more focus on Kabul, but I'm pretty well connected still with people, and I think some bad things are happening outside that we're not aware of, that many people are not aware of. It can't be confirmed, okay? But from some people that I sort of trust, I think some bad things are going on. So I think it's going to be some type of hybrid. We need to engage the whole international community. I think there is a stake. The good thing is there's a stake for most people, a stake in a stable Afghanistan. The Chinese, they have a border with Afghanistan. They're concerned about their Muslim community, so they don't want a fundamentalist, crazy exporting terrorism. The Russians, the same thing. They have great geopolitical interest in the former Soviet republics of Central Asia, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, even the Pakistanis, who've been, as Steen mentioned, the great patrons of the Taliban. They were the enablers of the Taliban, and gave sanctuary to the Quetta Shura, to the Taliban leadership over the past 20 years. For them, the Taliban is a two-edged sword. Yes, it could be used for their foreign policy and national security interests, particularly their interest in achieving strategic depth vis-a-vis India, okay, which again is another thing about how volatile the South Central Asia issue is. You have these two giant nations with nuclear weapons, and Afghanistan, an unstable Afghanistan is bad for that, and bad for all of us because of the nuclear element. So I would say that we all have a stake in that stability. Hopefully, if we do some, it's time for robust diplomacy. I agree with Secretary Blinken on that. But if it goes bad, then we're back in a pre-September 11 environment, and that's of course extremely dangerous for us and the whole world. Yes.
And hopefully we don't go there yet. You know, it could be the hybrid scenario you talked about, indeed, where, you know, they do see the need for international community and acknowledgement, but they're, you know, they at the same time they are capable of some pretty terrible things. And then Steen, if the Taliban does harbor terrorists again, this is kind of, you touched on oil, so I wanted to ask, will we see a sharp move in oil prices because the Al-Qaeda and ISIS, they might move towards one of their long-stated goals of regaining control over global oil markets?
I think there's a number of reasons why oil should be going higher, you know, and I think right now oil pretty much trades without a geopolitical risk premium. And classically, in history, we've had somewhere between $0 and $10 of geopolitical risk premium added to it. I think the case right now is certainly for an additional $5 of increase in that from Afghanistan on its own, and then you can add the breakdown in the Iran talks, and you know, maybe we should ask the ambassador what he foresees happening in Syria and Iraq, which I guess is next in line for the US to address. So it's going to be interesting, and I think what is really in geopolitical terms and market terms is the most interesting is the relative movement of China and Russia in the region, because that will dictate to me that what happens to oil and the interest in keeping in place the regime in Syria in the case of Russia, and of course the ever-present Iran story, where we now seem to be back to sort of like North Korea. It's the same cycle we keep repeating for every presidency. We still need to address the same issue.
So we do see higher oil prices. Yeah, and you know, I'm definitely going to touch on the points on you know, impact to the other countries in the region, and that's actually going to be my next question, set of questions. So we're going to talk now about geopolitical tensions in a global perspective, since both panelists are keen to talk about this. So there was actually a very good study done a few years back stating that unless a country had more than 20% share of global GDP, geopolitical tensions tend to structurally increase. Now, obviously, there are other factors like soft power that allows the country to outperform or underperform their economic power. But in terms of raw economic power, IMF data estimates that no country today accounts for 20% of global GDP. So the study concluded is why the world today has far more geopolitical stresses than other times in history. Ambassador Llorens, do you agree with the study where in this transition phase, we're going to experience more frequent, longer lasting, and more far-reaching geopolitical stresses?
Yeah, again, we had a little bit of this conversation yesterday. I would challenge this idea that no one has 20% of GDP. You know, again, this is my economist hat because I started as an economist. But the U.S., you measure GDP in market terms. PPP is a flawed construct. spent my whole life overseas. I mean, this has been my world. And PPP is good to measure, whether Germany has 100 times higher standard of living than Tanzania, but do Germans really eat 100 times more potatoes? It's very valuable as a development tool to show relative sort of standards of living. It's a development concept. It is not what design. It's been misinterpreted because it kind of shows that the Chinese economy is larger than the U.S. economy. It is not. The U.S. economy is still 24% of global GDP, and it's about a third larger than China's. That's just the fact. That's what the market value is, just the price of oil and everything else, right? And companies, compare in PPP terms, would you do it? Gazprom to Exxon, you wouldn't do it. You know that Exxon is more valuable, has higher value than Gazprom. Although if you actually looked at a PPP, you might get a different result, but it would be an absurd result. But I do agree with the premise, okay, that there is no, right now you have a rising power. China's great economic reawakening, the greatest expansion in economic history. And with it, it has, the Chinese have been able to build a formidable military force, and they are a peer competitor for the United States. And they represent in a strategic sense, in a long-term sense, a far bigger threat in the end than the Soviet Union. That's sort of the Marxist monolith. So you're right. I mean, the U.S. is not going to be, in raw power, whether it has 24% of GDP. It's not going to be able to sort of have its day. China is going to be there, and the U.S. is going to have to manage the China relationship. It is the most consequential relationship in the world. It is about, it's not just about the prosperity of the world, but it's also about global peace. If we get it wrong, it could be very bad for both sides. I would still say the United States is not going to be the unipolar moment is gone, but the U.S. will still be the most significant player in the world for a considerable amount of time. Again, I'm not going to give you what the time frame is. I'm not smart enough, but it still will be. Why? By extension of its system of alliances. I mean, no country in the history of the world, Rome or the old Chinese empires, no one had the network of alliances that the United States has in Europe, in the Middle East, in Latin America, in the Asia Pacific, unique. And that's because that's our genius in a way. Despite all of our mistakes and ineptitude, we have this ability of finding common interests with countries as diverse as, Japan and Colombia and make them very strong allies. So the U.S. will still be the most influential player, but no one's going to be dominant. China will continue to close the gap. That is the main diplomatic task of the United States in the coming 10, 15, 20 years is dealing with China.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the region. So what other geopolitical implications do you think will hold for the Middle East and entire South Central Asian region, especially with regards to Pakistan and Iran that we touched on? And could we also see another refugee crisis in Europe?
You asking me that question?
Yes.
Okay. I think in the Middle East, it will have very significant implications. I think look at Iran. You're in the middle of trying to see if you can restart the talks with Iran on the nuclear weapons issue. Meanwhile, Iran is a major player in Afghanistan. The Afghanistan situation has a huge impact on them. Remember, there is the Hazara community, which accounts for about 18% of the Afghan population, are Shias. They're Muslims of the Shia sect. They are Iran's cousins. They are very, very close. And so Iran is engaging with Afghanistan and making sure that they protect a number of equities, their security equities, the equities to their cousin Hazaras, and also with regards to water. which is a huge issue. The water issue between Iran, one of the main strategic issues that Iran will deal with Taliban is management of water in Western Afghanistan and the flow of the rivers into Iran. That would be a big issue. So any impact, the Afghan situation has on Iran is going to have an impact on the rest of the Middle East. And then it's how the Gulf states, again, what is the impact on them? The U.S. is clearly going to increase probably its military presence in the Gulf states because the president has made very clear that he will keep a very close eye on developments in Afghanistan. The concern that some of these international terror groups, taking the bad scenario, Al-Qaeda get reconstituted, the operations of ISIS-K. So you will see a buildup over time, I predict that, of U.S. military deployments in the Gulf states. And that will have an impact. But the reality, though, is as Steen is saying, if, Steen had made a great strategic point that overlaid on this, does this mean kind of it signals of a more generalized shift in the U.S. strategy in a global sense? Does it mean that maybe we'll have more military in numbers in the Gulf states, but that ultimately the U.S. is in a process of withdrawal, sort of long-term withdrawal from the Middle East? This is what Afghanistan is telling us, then it will have potentially some very significant impact on the region. And again, what you're going to see is more people move into a vacuum. So you'll see China playing a more important role in the Middle East. You certainly will have Russia play a more important role.
And Steen, do we have anything to add to that as well?
No, I think the consequence is already there to be seen. So classically, the UAE and Turkey has not been on the best friendly terms. Overnight, we had in the market a big rally in Turkish lira based on the fact that there's now open conversation between those two countries, and they actually opened a investment channel between those two countries. So, and that is kind of surprising considering that Qatar is basically the way that the Turkish play the Middle East to some extent. They are very close to the Qatarians. The Qatarians and the UAE, of course, classically over the last few years has been in somewhat of a disagreement. So I think we see already these microstructures changing, and that will change the macro structure in the sense that it's a free for all now that the US has left Afghanistan. And I'm not, again, like the ambassador, I'm not criticizing that they leave. I'm just, as a macro guy who has to deal with the impact on the future of the markets, this has already strengthened the Turkish lira because it's the first derivative consequence of the seen from the, certainly must be from the Turkish side, to engage other nations in the Gulf region. And I think even as OPEC plus met today, I think that was also on the table in the side conversations going on and that OPEC plus meeting, because they feel threatened. They don't know where the US stand. If an ambassador, and I'm sure he's right, is we're going to see increased presence in Doha, which of course is as I know, ambassador, the biggest presence that the US have. And of course, you have the 7 fleets always being deployed in the same area as well to support that militarily. That can work both ways. It can work as a wrong signal in terms of the Middle East, but at the same time, and I think the ambassador used the only word that really described this, there is a massive political vacuum that is soaking out a lot of light and energy right now that will be filled by other actors. And I think the most aggressive of those being Turkey, Russia, China certainly, and then the EU and the US and the UK needs to redefine their role in that new world.
Right. And then and all, like you guys mentioned the political vacuum. So there's going to be, it sounds like, more geopolitical risk, more geopolitical tensions for sure. So how should investors position their portfolios in light of these rising geopolitical risks?
I'm sure you want me to take that one, Ambassador.
No, absolutely.
But you can also chime in. Yeah,
that's where we all become accountable. The good thing about macro global strategy is that we are probably wrong, but who cares? No one remembers.
I'll be talking to my broker.
No, so maybe, and I see a few of the questions coming in is about the immediate consequences. I think one, big level talk, I think the US cannot afford to be engaged globally overseas. I think that is a reflection of the US economy, which is increasingly getting debt dependent. That is conclusion number one. I think we are in a secular weaker dollar, not in the next 6 months, but overall the dollar strength will continue to be diluted, but simply because of lack of productivity. I think, and don't get me wrong, the US will be back, but not in its present version of how the US sees itself, with all of this containment, closing down, looking inwards. It needs to go back to, being a freight train that really is the leadership. I think it will come. I think it's not missing. In terms of the immediate impact on the market, I've done a few things about this, and I actually put Peter Gowrie, our equity analyst, to the work and saying, and this is going to be so anti-ESG and compliant with the political correctness of the world today. But, think about it. If the US is leaving behind, and then most of the European counterparts, including Japan, not including, but also Japan, is way behind on military spending. I think one of the direct consequences here is that defense stocks around the world will increase significantly because governments need to replenish, they need to redirect. The US may use marginally the same amount of money. The rest of the world needs to step up because there is, again, a political military vacuum that needs to be filled. In Europe, it's made worse by the fact, of course, although UK, of course, is still part of NATO, they are not part of the inner conversation going on, both diplomatically, but certainly militarily in the EU on how to respond to Afghanistan, to the overall standoff, what is seen as a more erratic US foreign policy. So for me, defense spending is going to go up across the board. This is not a recommendation for those of you who want to be compliant with ESG. I'm just saying one of those things is certainly going to be the case. And then I think ultimately, what does increased military spending, what does increased securitization, not in the market sense, but in terms of securing security mean? It means more inflationary, it means more fiscal spending from a number of countries ex-US. So I think for me, US will continue to spend money for the reason it needs to become more productive and find the political juice again. But the rest of the world will need to spend more money on fiscal because they have, to be honest, and in all fairness, they have been too dependent on the US to take the blunt work of doing both the military work, but also doing the investment into military and the spin-off that comes naturally from military spending.
So possible outperformance for the defense sector, indeed. And Ambassador Llorens, anything to add?
No, certainly not on the portfolio side, but just a couple of final thoughts. Again, it was a very good question with the geopolitical impacts on Middle East and South Central Asia, and of course they will, as we just been discussing, they will be significant. But there are those broader impacts. I look at, for example, if you look at South Central Asia, I go back to the India, Pakistan, the two great regional powers. Certainly Pakistan very much closely aligned to China, but kind of India was realigning with the United States in terms of the U.S. approach towards the Asia Pacific, the U.S. approach in terms of dealing with China, adding India to that alliance system. I do think that the Afghanistan debacle complicates this because the Indians were relying on the United States to maintain the current Kabul government. This was a government that India strongly supported. They provided significant levels of economic assistance. They didn't want to provide military assistance because that gets you into the whole Muslim Hindu thing. They didn't want to, but they were a significant player, and I think that the Indians feel very let down. So U.S. credibility with India is down, and that impacts on the broader U.S. strategy vis-a-vis China. The U.S. is going to have to do a lot of work to India to kind of realign that. I think it'll succeed because ultimately there will be that commonality of interest, that whether the U.S. mishandled Afghanistan and let the Indians down in terms of the commitments there, that ultimately we have this common concern about China. So that would be one. And then the other thing is, again, going to kind of Steen's, let's focus on the global, the issue of if you have many things can happen. Let's say you have a massive refugee crisis. Let's say we get to scenario 2, the bad
Yep.
scenario, and you get 2 million, 3 million people going through Iran, heading to Turkey, and ultimately to Europe. What is the impact on Europe? I mean, I just recall again, the last time we had the Syria migration, it had huge political ramifications in Europe. And so I just think these things, if you get a stampede of a couple of million people, there will be a major political impact inside of Europe. I don't know, we all hope that doesn't happen.
Yeah, we all hope so, yeah. But the last thing Europe needs is another refugee crisis. Steen, any thoughts before we open it up to Q&A from the audience?
No, just I think for the audience, I think it's important to understand that Biden has defined his presidency by 3 C's. It's COVID, it's climate, and it's China. So the thing we didn't talk about here is that among a lot of foreign policy observers, it seems pretty clear that one of the reasons why he wants to pivot out Afghanistan is to refocus all. And I think the ambassador addressed that a few times. He's going to focus his whole attention on China. So also in terms of market impact, expect this very prevalent anti-China rhetoric, both in political terms, but also in practical terms, to increase as this Afghanistan goes into memories, and then we start to see the U.S. New redefining itself. And what we haven't talked about, if I was a Taiwanese democracy leader today, I'll be very concerned. If it was Japan, I will be very concerned. I think there's a number of countries around the world who are having the same kind of conversation that the ambassador has been so nice to join in with today. But this very conversation we're having today, what does it mean? What will happen? What will be the impact? Is a conversation that I guarantee you national security advisors around the world is scrambling to come up with the same answers.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, definitely there will be implications to China-Taiwan relations. But let's open it up to Q&A. So for those who have questions, please type them in the chat box. I will share this right here. So yes, please type your questions in the chat box and we will answer them. So let me just see what kind of questions we have. Stop sharing. Okay, so one of them is asking, do you think the Taliban will be moderates in line with allies and allies' request? I think we answered that one. We touched on it. I think they will be, as Ambassador Llorens alluded to earlier, it's kind of a hybrid scenario between, they want to have international recognition, but at the same time, they're not going to be a true democracy, really. And then another question, should we not have settled before, and this is to the ambassador, as it could never have ended in winning? Imran Khan, the Pakistan Prime Minister, was always of the opinion of a dialogue for peace. Why do we not listen to the people close to the ground and those who understand the people?
Yeah, again, I agree that the U.S. we knew that there was no victory to be had in Afghanistan, military victory, by 2011, 2012. We had 100,000 U.S. troops. We had 140,000 NATO troops. And if you knew the nature of the fight, that we weren't going to win this, as long as the Taliban was able to have a sanctuary in Pakistan. And again, the whole issue of Pakistan gets extremely complicated. Pakistan is a major non-NATO ally of the U.S. The U.S. provides significant military assistance to the Pakistanis. The Pakistanis actually support us in terms of targeting some of the international terror groups, the ISIS-K and Al-Qaeda. So we work with them. But on the Taliban issue, they did not cooperate. They were the principal patrons of the Taliban. The Taliban leadership, as I mentioned, Quetta was based in Pakistan. The sanctuary, in the winter, it's a season of war. When the winter, the passes freeze, Taliban fighters would go on R&R in Pakistan. A wounded Pakistani Taliban soldier would get medical assistance in Pakistan. The Taliban trained in Pakistan. They had access to arms and munitions in Pakistan. And you know, if you take the Haqqani network, which is a very potent faction of the Taliban, I would argue from the intelligence that I've seen over many, many years, that they're kind of a tool of ISI, which is Pakistani military intelligence. So the Pakistanis have been able, a key element in sustaining the Taliban insurgency, which numbered anywhere from 45 to 80,000 men, depending on the time. There's no victory to be had. When I was ambassador in 2016, 2017, in that first year of the Trump administration, that was our premise. Remember what I said at the very beginning? We created a sustainable package, very small, but very, with a lot of strategic effect, military, diplomatic, intelligence, and development. But ultimately, for the purposes of creating conditions in Afghanistan and in the region involving Pakistan, Iran, it dealt with China. It was a regional South Asian strategy, ultimately with the purpose of bringing the Taliban to the table, and that there would ultimately be an Afghan, an Afghan negotiation that would end the conflict, a political settlement. And so that was I believe passionately, this was my world, that it could have been achieved. Didn't need to stay another 5 years or 10 years. The military dynamic was such that the Taliban would have settled. I'm going to give you a real data point, which I think is important. In the 2017, when I was ambassador, when I was leaving the country at the very end of the year, we maintained casualty figures, which we don't publicize, okay? Because we're out of the kill ratio Vietnam era. With the Afghan army in the lead, with 95% of the fighting, 99% of the dying, with US and NATO providing a small enabling force, we probably killed, captured, or removed from the battlefield, wounded, about 17,000 Taliban fighters, okay? How many US soldiers were lost in Afghanistan in 2017? 17. So we had them, we finally had achieved the asymmetry. And the reason for that is that the Taliban cannot maneuver for strategic effect without being able to concentrate forces. And the way we have very sophisticated intelligence communications nodes, trust me, if 150 Taliban concentrated in one place to attack a city, within 15 minutes, we would have either an F-16, a Predator drone, an Apache gunships. Within 15 minutes would be over them, putting high precision ordnance on them. Taliban morale was at the bottom when I left. Infantry morale at the end of 2017. They came to the table. Our strategy worked. They agreed to negotiate. But again, as Steen has mentioned, the political imperative won out, both with two presidents. I mean, it's not, I don't make those decisions. I carry out the president's decisions. They're paid to make those strategic decisions. And both President Trump, President Biden made the decision that I would argue to prematurely depart the country. So it kind of unnecessary. This idea that we were doomed to failure, I think, is again, this is my world, was a flawed construct. And I think both leaders made major strategic mistakes, and we'll pay the price over many, many years.
Indeed, right. Okay, thanks for that. We have a lot of questions coming in, so let's kind of go through them. US-Afghan non-defense spending seem to support large-scale corruption. Is this not the reason of the collapse? Basically, the local people were not part of the gravy train and so did not support the current Afghan government. I think you kind of touched on that. Anything you want to add?
If Steve could lead on that, and I'll provide my comments. Okay. So is that good?
Yep, yeah. No, I'm fine to do that, Ambassador. Being a Scandinavian from the least corrupt country in the world, I don't think I'm in a position to actually comment too much on that. But corruption, of course, is a tax on business whether it is in Italy or in the US or anywhere else. So of course it's part of it. But I think it's the governability of Afghanistan and the fact that Afghanistan is so central to how the British perceived the access to India, the Pakistan story, the China story now with the Uyghurs. No, so I don't think that is the main driver, but of course it accelerated the process, Ambassador.
Yeah, no, and look, corruption was a huge problem in Afghanistan, as it is in many, third world countries. And this idea that we were going to create, Denmark in Afghanistan, right? Never going to happen, ever. And so, the way I look at it, even starting in the Bush administration from day one, if you tried to create a formula for Afghanistan, there was a big variable in there was corruption. And we contributed to that. We contributed to that because we were putting in so much money so quickly. If it was a more normal developing country, if it was Peru, where there's a lot of corruption, but you could do it, the development assistance was more measured, you could help do it in a way that at least within their own context, you could try to mitigate corruption. In Afghanistan, we were just spending too much money. So the opportunities for corruption were massive. And yes, many people made huge fortunes. Trust me, I know them well. So that was a flaw in the system. But at the same time, we achieved progress. This didn't make any headlines in the newspapers, but I'll give you 3 data points. Number one, as education. In 2001, Taliban run Afghanistan. There were 600,000, 650,000 kids in school, kindergarten through university. No women. The women were not allowed to attend school. The girls were at home. Today, right now, there are 8.5 million students K through university, and 40% are women. When I was ambassador, one of the most gratifying experiences for me, in the midst of all the complications and violence and dysfunctionality of Afghanistan, go to a university and sit down with a group of women who were studying, who were law students, who were studying to get MBAs. A whole new world was created. Women are entrepreneurs. They own businesses. They're in parliament. There are civil society organizations advocating for women's rights. And there was a whole new generation. Steen mentioned the fact that 70% of the population is sort of under 25. Right on. This is good. This is a new generation that was being created that would have been a platform for stability in the long term. So that investment yielded returns. The other one would be health, which is important. I mean, Afghanistan did not have a healthcare system in 2001 at all. Zero. It did not exist. A lot of investments by the US and its European allies. Today, 60% of Afghans are a 45-minute walking distance from a clinic where they can get basic health care. The end result is watch. I look at 2 data points. Maternal mortality rates and infant mortality rates have declined dramatically. There's a lot more. And then finally, I would say communications. Back in 2001, Afghanistan was one of the most autarkic countries in the world. Think North Korea. And then think Afghanistan and the Taliban. That has completely changed. I mean, Afghanistan became a very open society and open to the world, despite the war. There were a couple of thousand telephones in Afghanistan in 2001. Today, there are 23 million cell phones in a country of 32 million people. And when I lived in Afghanistan, I would be in some rural area with all my security rattling around a convoy. And I would see a woman with a burqa, and I could see she had a cell phone. She was connected. So just 3 elements of things that were very positive in the last 20 years.
Right. Thank you for that. Questions on China that Steen touched on. So what are the opportunities and risks for China as the US pulls out? And will there be impact on the Chinese economy with more dominance in the region and absence of the US? I think, Steen, maybe you could take that one. 2 questions, actually.
I think the first part is probably for the ambassador. In terms of what people forget about China is they don't have a history of being on foreign soil. It's never, even back to the early days, been a conquering regime or a government that's until recently even have a navy. So classically, China is not going overseas to stay overseas in terms of military action. So they may change, but certainly that's not been the case before. I don't think that there is significant change to the Chinese economy, but there is, as we already seen with the copper mine that the ambassador referenced. China is in a process of trying to secure their own domestic-driven economy, including semiconductors, copper mining, and all of the minings that we see they do throughout, certainly Africa and other places. So I think we see continuation of that, but that will be driven by at arm's length from the government through state-owned enterprises and businesses that are in there to secure the long-term independence of China in the region. That will be the economic drive. But I leave for the ambassador to sort of talk to the Chinese in the political sense.
Well, just very quick. I mean, I think China has an opportunity in Afghanistan. So if you take that hybrid scenario, there is an opportunity that's a long term. Chinese are very comfortable thinking longer term for them to be able to create conditions where they may be able to have significant investments in the mining sector and in the hydrocarbon sector. I see that. Then, as you know, assuming that the Taliban remain in power for the considerable future, as you know, Pakistan will be the key ally. Pakistan is a major ally, will be the key player in Afghanistan. China has that close relationship, strategic relationship with Pakistan. How will Afghanistan fit into Belt and Road? Again, we're talking longer term, but I think the Chinese are very comfortable thinking longer term. So there will be openings for China. I think a potential victory for China, putting it all on the table, is the fact that Afghanistan has major reserves of rare earths, an area where China dominates. We were looking very closely, and I was very much involved in that in my period as ambassador, of looking at the lithium reserves, particularly in southern and western Afghanistan. We had geologists look at it, the pools were there, and we were very much in advanced discussions with the Afghan government to give some American mining companies and European, obviously it's an alliance, some potential concessions. And you know, they're amazing. Again, the problem is always security, but well, of course, but the cost was actually, you know, there were even some favorable costs on this, even doing it, some of it by air. So I really see this as providing, with the US sort of out, we were not going to be the big player with the Taliban. I really don't see that. I mean, we're going to have to engage the Taliban, but we're in a kind of damage control. It provides an opportunity, a long-term strategic play for China.
Okay, thank you for that. Getting more questions coming in. To the ambassador, the tone and actions of the US and other key countries indicate strongly that they will recognize the Taliban as a legitimate government in Afghanistan, regardless of their history and their stance on human rights issues or political inclusion. How do you think these countries will justify that? And what messages will that send to the US allies in the Middle East and in Asia?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have an answer for that. That's a really good question. Look, remember, President Biden came into office with his two key themes, three key themes, and Steen mentioned this. Number one, restoring America's credibility with our allies, right? Which had been frayed, particularly with President Trump's, the way he mishandled our NATO allies. So re-engaging with our allies, number one. And then number two, certainly saying that the US as a democracy, again, this idea of the democratic summit, the US as a leader of the free world, as a preeminent democratic nation after the tumult of the Trump period. And then, of course, China, as Steve mentioned. But I think that creates, yes, we want to have a practical policy towards Afghanistan. The Taliban's likely be in power for a long time. We have interest there. We need to deal with a Taliban-run Afghanistan along with our allies. But the president needs to be careful, because this issue of the US sort of kowtowing to the people who defeated us, okay, is delicate politically in the US. Again, the president, there are potential, the Republicans are going to be hammering away that we were defeated by this fourth-rate military power, and they're going to be hammering home on that. Number two, that the president was incompetent, negligent in the way he implemented his own strategy. And so I think he's going to deal with the Taliban, but I think because of domestic political reasons, he will have to be careful.
Okay, thanks for that. Let's shift to the markets a little bit. Question for Steen. Hey, Steen, as traders, where should our interests lay?
10,000 feet, structurally weaker dollar, increased geopolitical risk in the oil market, defense stocks, and then on the risk side, the downside risk is this, which both the ambassador I've mentioned a few times, is the refugee crisis. If that spill over, that had a massive impact on the political world as seen from Europe, but also from a market perspective. So the way that things has been evolving in Turkey, I think that Erdogan right now feels very strongly that he's in a position to negotiate and dictate what goes on. So downside risk on that side, but weaker dollar, defense stocks, marginal higher fiscal spending globally, which will drive again the shortage of what the ambassador talked about and explained really well, that this resource base, I mean, we have a shortage of resources. I think we are getting into the second wave on reflation based on this, because governments need to spend on green. Now they also need to spend on military spending, and they also need to fight inequality in any shape and form. This is, at the end of the day, very expensive exercise. So expect continuation of reflation, green transformation, spending, and ultimately, I think to risk inflation from that, and the refugee crisis, which I think is going to be very, very hard to contain. Because of course, if you have 70% of the population being under the age of 25, never experienced the true phase of Taliban, then they want to have an alternative upbringing, which is geographically easier to get in Europe than it is to get in the US, obviously.
Right. Thank you for recapping that elaborately. Question on Sunni and China. So maybe you guys touched on this. So you mentioned the protection concern of the Hazaris by the Iranian government. Do you think there will be tensions between the Sunni and China influences in the Middle East? And he is referring to the conflict between Iran and other Sunni Islamic countries in the Middle East. Ambassador, anything? Would you have anything to add?
In the context of Afghanistan, again, remember, some of the Gulf states were supporters of the Taliban back in the battle days of 1996, 2001. I think the only three countries that recognized the Taliban government at the time, the Emirate, was Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. And there are people who are very fundamentalist Sunnis in the Gulf who there was some compatibility of theology with the Taliban, their interpretation of Sharia law, their interpretation of Islam. So does that concern Iran? Yes. So, and it's reflected in Afghanistan, as we know. The Taliban were horrible with the Hazara community the last time out. They're sending good signals that they want, that they want to treat the Hazaras fairly. But again, when you get at the base level, if you look at those Taliban fighters, this is like a base that is very fundamentalist. Whatever, you can have a political leader like Baradar sitting in Qatar in a 5-star hotel, and maybe he has changed. But there is that dynamic. So the potential tensions between the Sunnis and the Shia are going to be there, potentially could spill over into violence. That will impact on Iran-Afghan relations. Now, you're asking me a big question. I am not a Middle East expert, okay? And so for me to say how much the way that, if something like that were to happen, how that spills over into the broader tensions in the Middle East between Sunnis and Shia, don't have an answer. But, there has to be some impact because, again, I see the Saudis sort of quietly is very much supporting the Taliban. Yes?
Yep. Okay, thank you. Somebody really wants to get this answer because they have asked this 3 times. Given the recent U.S. involvement in preventing the Russia-Germany pipe, and ultimate going ahead U.S. interests, could it be assumed that U.S. pulling out of Afghanistan is a reaction to that? Given another refugee crisis will greatly destabilize the EU more than anyone else. And he was referring to U.S. involvement in the Russian-Germany pipe.
I don't see the link, Steve.
No, I'm a little bit slightly confused as well. So we're talking about the Nord Stream, which of course has been both Biden and Trump has been vile and very, very vocal on being against that enabler of Russian impact on European policy, obviously, which, you know, from my chair is going to be a failed attempt anyway by the US. It's not like US listen to the US. Not like the US listen to the Europe when they have concerns. I mean, look at how they messed up the COVID-19 ability to travel where the Americans were. I mean, I think what we have to realize is that Trump probably initiated, but I think Biden has made worse, is the fact that Biden may not be more flawless and more politically correct, but you still have pretty much the same opinions, whether it's China or Europe or anything else. So for my money, you know, Nord Stream is a dead end for the Americans to impact because Europe is short of energy. They need the energy, whether you want it or not. It's going to happen. But I don't see it's a tit for tat in terms of Afghanistan was. I think the ambassador said it best. I mean, Ambassador, you, as I remember, and please correct me, but you said, you know, even from the early days of being on the ground in 2001, Bush wanted out immediately from Afghanistan. It's never been any of the presidents since then's intention to stay, and certainly not overstay as it ended up being anyway. So I don't think it really works in that scenario. I think it's 2 very different things, and they should be seen as an independent incidents. But you know, I think the question is right in the sense that it is overall a derivative of the U.S. foreign policy, which is that it's more talk than it's action, and you know, some people will like that, some people will hate that, but I think that is. And that's why I keep referring back to the Nixon doctrine as sort of set it in motion, the change of how the Americans see themselves and trying to instill on the rest of the world how you should not expect the US to step up every single time to be the policeman.
And I guess that kind of answers the next question. Maybe you guys have anything to add. That's Vietnam 1971, Kuwait 1991, Iraq 2011, Afghanistan 2021. Is it just a coincidence of years, or a generation cycle when the US withdraws from the political shaping of a given country?
Well, you know, clearly we have, you know, the United States has suffered many setbacks. Clearly, Vietnam the decision to intervene in Vietnam was a disaster, was a strategic disaster. And it ended in a disastrous result in 1975 with the overthrow by the North Vietnamese of the 2 governments. So we've had a series of setbacks. The United States is very, very active in the world. We have a lot of activity. We are involved in many places. We are a global power with that has had unparalleled reach, whether good or bad. We have made many mistakes. We're highly erratic and mistake prone. At the same time, I think overall the US has been a force for good in the world. I mean, if you look at the world order that we created after the end of World War II, whether in terms of the alliances that helped maintain the peace during a very dangerous time in the Cold War, our very prudent handling of our nuclear power post 1945, our influence, and it was a unique influence in creating a more liberal trading and investment order in the world that has led to prosperity everywhere, whether it's Japan, Taiwan, China. Deng Xiaoping followed that path. Europe, the reconstruction of Europe with the Marshall Plan. You know, the United States has done a lot of good in the world. And so I think overall we are, again, within the context of history, if you look way back into history, I think the US record is a relatively benign power. But we have done bad things and made huge errors and hurt a lot of people as well. That's just the way it is.
Indeed. Another question, actually, is there any chance that Afghanistan will build an Islamic regime similar to Qatar or Dubai on the long term?
What was that again?
Yes. Is there any chance that Afghanistan will build an Islamic regime similar to Qatar or Dubai over the long term?
Again, I am not a Middle East hand. I don't know what's ultimately going to happen in Afghanistan. I mean, we're at the early stages, but I would say that if you ask me to crystal ball it and taking this idea that we kind of agreed on the hybrid scenario, but I see kind of in Iran, the mullahs, not as democratic, by the way. Iran has had free elections and you had candidates, moderates, more fundamentalist. I don't see you're going to see that much margin in Afghanistan, but you will have sort of this field. Akhundzada, I think, will be the leader. The leader of the Taliban will become the leader of Afghanistan, and he is very much a religious figure. Okay, he is the religious patron of the Taliban movement. You could have Baradar, who is the deputy Taliban chief, serve as a kind of a prime minister, but it will be very much of a theological theocracy. So think a little bit like Iran, but not as, I think Iran will be more liberal than Afghanistan in the end. Although on paper, Afghanistan may create this interim government and bring in some other people. They may bring in some Hazaras as a signal to the Iranians. So maybe on the surface it will look more open, but my sense is that it'll be a theocracy that will be less open than Iran. I mean, that's my personal view. I could be dead wrong.
Okay, thank you. Another question: with the way things are unfolding in the last few days or a week, do you think things can become worse? Contribute to the tension between India and Pakistan? There is a narrative that the Pakistan army uses the Taliban to create tension in Kashmir. What does that mean to the world markets?
I'm going to then turn it over for the economic financial impact very quickly. That is a big concern. The destabilization of Afghanistan, if it continues. So we're looking at more scenario 2. We would be highly destabilizing in terms of India-Pakistan relations. And that is the consequential dynamic of the whole South Central Asia region. So it is very dangerous. If all of a sudden extremist groups, fundamentalist groups are reconstituting, planning, training in ungoverned spaces of Afghanistan and then striking at India, okay, that would be extremely destabilizing.
Mm-hmm. And Steve, anything to add to that?
I can only add that I think the question is fair in the sense that there are so many moving pieces that we don't know ultimately how things are going to evolve. But to use the Afghanistan situation to destabilize the situation between India and Pakistan, I don't see as an immediate risk. Not that it's not already there. But that would be very difficult to play. Also because you have to remember, everything equal, is still talking about democratic nation that is run by according to a protocol of a political majority and the like. So no, I don't see that as an immediate impact. But having said that, I think the compounding of everything that the ambassador so excellently have explained to us in terms of the moving pieces, that is extremely difficult, because compounding exactly means that a small mistake becomes a big mistake and a small success becomes a big success. So there will be success story, there will be failures. But what I think we need to end this conversation on is that there is an absolute need to be alert to the situation in Afghanistan, in the Middle East. And I think for me, as a long-term macro guy, this political void or vacuum that's been created, how that position will go on. Because I think one commentator this morning was making the analogy that it's still a bit like China and Russia has been allowed to be teenagers, but only because we always knew that it, in this case, the US, will ultimately come home and dole out the penalty at the end of the day. Now, daddy's not coming home anymore. The two children are living on their own. And what that will means two things. One, they need to grow up and take responsibility. But, I think any teenager makes mistake. And that's where I see the question being relevant. There will be make mistake. I once shared a stage at a conference with the head of the UK military forces globally, and he said, Steen, what tends to happen is that it's not the intent of people to starting wars or starting conflicts, but somehow it happens by mistake. And this is ingrained in military training. I mean, this is not the negative macro guy with 30 years of experience in the market saying this. This is a military command of all the British forces telling me that in their view, the biggest operational risk they have is risk, and very often communication risk issues. And I think, and Ambassador, I think you would agree with me, this situation of Afghanistan plays to exactly that scenario, that someone misinterprets, someone gets the calculation wrong in terms of how they respond in kind to what they see as a provocation.
Okay.
Completely agree. Completely agree.
An interesting question here. How likely is that Iran uses the distraction and develops and tests its first nuke, or Israel attacks Iran to stop that from happening? And what are the implications of Israel-Iran war to the markets? And how much will the US support Israel then?
Let me take that, Ambassador. I think now
Please.
we're getting into outrageous prediction. I think the audience should join me and the team. It's making outrageous predictions for 2022, and I don't think it's fair on the ambassador or certainly not me either to respond to that. I understand in kind, and the question is no different, and the answer is no different for what I just said on Pakistan and India. So I think, with all due respect, Lester, I think we need to move to maybe the final question and let these poor people off with all this talking, and not from me, but sorry, from me, but also thanking the ambassador for all the time and the great insight.
Yeah, thank you. I guess we have a last question. There's still a lot of questions, but we'll try our best to answer them afterwards. Given, let's see. There was just some that came in for Steen, actually, with regards to, I guess, one for Steen and then one for the ambassador. So Steen, with regards to defense stocks, when you talk about potential bounce as other countries gear up, however, isn't there also a risk that the USA will in fact cut back on defense as it becomes less interventionist and more Scandinavian, quotes, in outlook?
I think the ambassador indirectly, I think it's a reallocation of resources. I'll let the ambassador talk to that. But I think the point that the ambassador made very well and very eloquently is that the Americans still have a huge amount of interest. I think there is an economic constraint on US military spending, but not in the sense that the size of relative to GDP will go down, more in the sense that it's been growing exponentially pretty much since the 9/11 incident. And the 9/11 became very much a defining moment in how America allowed defense spending to increase percentage-wise far higher. I think, in other words, I think defense spending militarily will increase percentage more in the US, in Europe than in US, but I think overall the US is not going to scale back.
Okay. Thank you. Last question to Ambassador Llorens, since we're running out of time. And this person has two questions in one. With the benefit of hindsight, how would any US presence in Afghanistan have been better played out? And what was the root cause of the failed on-the-ground intelligence to successfully anticipate and mitigate the fallout we have seen in recent weeks from the US exit?
Look, what a way to cap it all up. Look, I want to emphasize we made huge mistakes in Afghanistan. All the presidents have made their fair share of mistakes. We spent an inordinate amount of money. A lot of it was wasted, no doubt about it. I do think that, but on balance, on net, we also did some good things. I discussed the fact that Afghanistan was never used as a platform to attack the United States and its allies. So we were able to decimate, Al Qaeda. We were able to decimate ISIS-K, certainly when I was there, although I believe they're starting to reconstitute. We saw the recent attack last week. So we achieved that objective over 20 years. And we contributed to making some major positive socioeconomic gains. But this would be a kind of a balance sheet. If it was a corporation, right, it wasn't very efficiently run. So the lessons are that we probably didn't have a sufficiently good understanding of the situation on the ground. And that reflects a lot of our own problem as Americans. It's less about Afghanistan and more about the U.S. And it reflects a little bit of a kind of, it's hubristic. There's a lot of hubris there. We thought we could do it, we could figure it out, we could win, we could develop, we could create a democracy. So a lot of flawed thinking on our part. We all know that. I mean, but if I leave with any, I've been a big critic of what Presidents Trump and Biden have done. I believe we actually had learned some lessons, very costly ones, and I thought we were in a good place. But you know what? Whatever I say is irrelevant. It's water under the bridge. And we have to, this is what I'd like to conclude. It's never a game over in the lives of people and nations. I talked about Afghanistan and the grinding of empires at the very beginning, from the ancient Persians to Alexander the Great to the Mongols. Afghanistan is still going to be there, right? And we need to deal with it. Afghanistan is going to be a country that we should not ignore. In fact, we ignore at our peril. We're just going to have to figure out a smart way of dealing with it in the years ahead. Okay?
Thank you. And with that, time is now up. And thank you, everyone, for their questions. I apologize that we may not be able to answer all of them, but please contact your Saxo representative and we'll make sure to get back. Thanks again to everyone for joining us today, and to Ambassador Llorens and Steen for sharing their unique insights. A replay of the webinar will be available, so please contact us if you would like to review what we have discussed. Thanks again to the panelists, everyone, and goodbye. Bye-bye. Thank you.